Hey guys, today we are talking about those angle pairs again and how we can use them when we know that those two lines at the transversal intersects are parallel. So we're going to start off with 4 new postulates and theorems to go along with our angle pair relationships that we know. So our first one is a postulate. It's the corresponding angles postulate. It says if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. So you'll notice there's a picture over here. Angle 2 and angle 6 are considered corresponding angles. So angle 2 and angle 6 are going to have the same angle measure. Those angles are congruent to each other. The next one we have is a theorem. It's the alternate interior angles theorem. And it tells us that if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of alternate interior angles are going to be congruent. So in this case, we have angle 4 and angle 5 that are our alternate interior angles. Those are going to be congruent to each other. They will have the same angle measure. Next up, we have the alternate exterior angles theorem. Very similar to the alternate interior angles theorem, except we're talking about the alternate exterior angles. So if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of alternate exterior angles are also congruent. So angle 1 and angle 8 are congruent to each other. Our final theorem that we have is the consecutive interior angles theorem. That says if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then the pairs of consecutive interior angles, so angle 3 and angle 5, they're not congruent like our other 3. They are going to be supplementary. So the next thing I want you to try is we're going to assume that this line is parallel to this line. And I can see that it looks like it's probably angle 4, since it's not labeled, is 70 degrees. So I want you to write out on your paper the measure of angle 1, measure of angle 2, and so on. And I want you to tell me what those angle measures are, as well as how you determine that. What postulate or theorem did you use? And remember, we also have our linear pair postulate, and we have our vertical angles congruence theorem. You are going to go over this tomorrow with some of your classmates, and you probably will not have the same answers because there's multiple ways to get there. So determine what the measure of angle 1 would be, and then tell us why. What would the measure of angle 2 be, and why? That's what you're doing for each of those, and so we'll come back and discuss that in class. Okay, so some other types of things that we can do is once we know that those theorems work, we can do some algebra work to solve for unknown variables. So first thing we need to look at, it says find the value of x, but I have two parallel lines that are being cut by a transversal. So here's one of my angles at 113 degrees, and here's another one at 3x minus 4 degrees. So I need to determine what kind of angle I have. And it's turned in a different direction, but they're on opposite sides of the transversal, and they're both outside. So these are alternate exterior angles. And I know from our alternate exterior angles theorem then that those two angles are going to have the same measure. They're congruent to each other. So I have 3x minus 4 and 113 should be equal. So then we can just do the algebra. So we add 4 to both sides. So then 3x equals 117. Then I'm going to divide by 3. And x would equal 39. And that's all it asks you for. It doesn't ask you to plug it back in. So x is 39 is our final answer. We can box that in. All right, another kind of example you might see is talking about runways on an airport. So a taxiway is being constructed that intersects two parallel runways at an airport. You know the measure of angle 2 is 98 degrees. So the measure of angle 2 is 98 degrees. It wants to know the measure of angle 1. Well, again, we're looking. Here's our two parallel lines cut by a transversal. I see that those angles are on opposite sides of the transversal, and they're both on the inside. So my how do you know? These are alternate interior angles, and so our alternate interior angles theorem tells us that the angles have the same measure. So if we know the measure of angle 2 is 98 degrees, then we also know the measure of angle 1 is 98 degrees. Okay, here's another one. It says find the value of x. So I see those two parallel lines. I see the transversal, but when I look to see what angle pairs I have them on opposite sides of the transversal, but I have one interior and one exterior. So those aren't an angle pair that I know. So there's lots of different ways we can look at this. But we need to get to an angle pair relationship that we do know. So one thing I immediately see is this 3x minus 7 up here would correspond to this angle right here. So if I know that this top one is 3x minus 7, I also know that this would be 3x minus 7. However, then that means that we have a linear pair. So think back, when we know about linear pairs, we know that linear pairs add up to 180. They are supplementary. So instead of putting an equal sign there, I'm going to add them together and I'm going to set them equal to 180 because they're supplementary. They're not the same. So I have 3x plus x gives me 4x, and I have minus 7 plus 5 gives me a minus 2, equals 180. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So 4x equals 182. I divide by 4, and we get that x equals 45.5. Since it said find the value of x, we can box that in and we are finished right there. Okay, don't forget if you didn't do those 7 missing angle pairs to go back and do those. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to come in and see me before school, after school, during bronco time. I will see you in class.